Hello. It's been a while, and I don't even know if I'll be able to get past one chapter today, so this was really not planned at all, so let's see how this goes. All right, so we are now on chapter Paula. Many of the refugees in Clarkston had been displaced by events far removed from their immediate lives. The decision of some despot hundreds of miles away to clear a region of a particular ethnic or political group in order to seize its resources, or the sudden appearance of soldiers in a village, fighting for a remote cause with no concern for collateral damage. For these refugees, the events that sent them running for their lives had a mysterious and unknowable quality, like a life-altering natural disaster. For others, though, there was no mistaking the reasons for their flight, the specific people who had driven them to flee, or even how their seemingly circumscribed personal stories fit into the broader political narratives of their countries and ethnic groups. Paula Bel Bellegam I'm so sorry. Bellegemeyer? I'm sorry. I'm really sorry if it's that's not pronounced correctly. Fell into the latter category. A refugee from the Democratic Republic of Congo, she had arrived in Clarkston with her 6 children in 2004 after escaping Africa's deadliest conflict in modern times, the Second Civil War in Congo, formerly Zaire, which raged from 1998 to 2002 and claimed an estimated 5.4 million lives. To get to safety in a new country, Paula had been forced to make a terrible choice: to remain near her husband, Joseph, who had been thrown into one of Congo's most notorious prisons in a political purge, and to live under constant threat of violence or death herself, or to leave her husband behind and take her children to a life in an unknown town in another hemisphere. The long chain of dominoes that led to that aching choice first began to fall more than 100 years before, in 1884 in Berlin, and tumbled through the 20th century until ultimately bursting through the doorway of a small house at 19 Rue Remy in Brazzaville, the capital of the Republic of Congo, in the middle of the night on January 28, 2001. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Paula's homeland, occupies territory deep in the heart of Africa that remained mostly beyond the reach of Western powers until the 1870s, when the Welsh-born explorer Henry Morton Stanley became the first Westerner to successfully traverse Central, soon courted by King Leopold II of Belgium, a weak monarch who believed that Belgium should emulate other European powers by establishing its own colonies in Central Africa. In 1884, at a conference of European leaders in Berlin, Leopold held himself out as a kind of protector of the Congo's people and proposed the formation of a political entity there called the Congo Free State. Leopold formed a corporation with himself as the lone shareholder and funded Stanley to return to the Congo region to build a railway deep into the jungle that would allow for the systemic looting of its natural resources, primarily rubber and ivory. Extraordinary brutality followed. Leopold's men enslaved natives and literally worked them to death. Families were separated, non-compliant villages burned, and those who disobeyed the brutal security apparatus, the force publique, had their right hands chopped off, or worse. The savagery went unchallenged until a report written by a British consul named Roger Casement detailed the horrors that had befallen the people of the Congo. He estimated that 3 million had died, while current scholars put the number at between 5 and 10 million, causing an uproar in Europe that gave birth to the modern human rights movement, and that eventually, in 1908, forced Leopold to cede control of the Congo Free State to the Belgian parliament. The Belgian government oversaw the Congo for another 52 years, during which it gradually lost control to ethnic and regional leaders. The emergence of African nationalism further weakened Belgian control of its colony, and in 1960, the Republic of Congo was granted independence. Prime Minister. The new nation was really an arbitrary assembly of ethnic groups and tribes with little in common, save their location within an imposed and haphazardly drawn border. So ethnic and tribal tensions immediately set in. Lumumba, after turning to the Soviet Union for backing, was tortured and killed by a commander named Joseph Desire Mobutu, an act done with the blessing, if not the outright aid, of the CIA. Mobutu renamed the country Zaire and appointed himself president, a post he held for 32 years with the support of the United States, which was eager to have a Cold War ally in the heart of Africa. Mobutu soon became the caricature of a violent, dictatorial kleptocrat. Recognizable to Westerners for his leopard skin pillbox hat and gaudy, large frame glasses, Mobutu bought villas and yachts in Europe, flew around on the Concorde, and stashed billions of dollars in Swiss banks, including one he bought for himself. To distract the public from his misrule, he fomented ethnic rivalries and supported guerrilla movements in neighboring countries that killed countless civilians. Nevertheless, President Ronald Reagan praised Mobutu as a voice of good sense and goodwill. But when the Cold War ended, financial and political support from Washington waned. To continue funding his extravagance, Mobutu simply appropriated the national treasury, printing money whenever he needed it, which led to staggering inflation that further weakened his failing country. An aging Mobutu supported Hutu militias in the eastern districts of his country and in Rwanda. Militias, that ultimately contributed to the Rwandan genocide. He then found his country destabilized when hundreds of thousands of Hutu refugees fled into refugee camps in the eastern provinces of North and South Kivu, fearing retribution from Tutsis in Rwanda. Mobutu's own army allied with Hutus in those camps, a move that led a broad coalition of Tutsis and other ethnic groups in eastern Zaire to form their own militia and join forces with the governments of Rwanda and Uganda against Mobutu. The leader of this coalition was a man named Laurent Désiré Kabila, a former Marxist rebel who had been educated in France and was, until his rapid ascension to power, a relative unknown in Congo. Kabila's coalition defeated Mobutu's entrenched regime with surprising ease, and in May 1997, Kabila entered Kinshasa and declared himself president of a country he renamed the Democratic Republic of Congo. Mobutu fled the country for Morocco, where he died a few months later. Paula and Joseph Balgamir were from Bukavu, the capital city of South Kivu on the border with Rwanda, which had been overrun with Hutu refugees in the wake of the Rwandan genocide. Paula taught dressmaking, and her husband was an information officer at a local farmers collective. There were Tutsis, and allied with a group in Laurent Kabila's coalition led by a military commander named Anselme Masasu Ndanga. When Kabila assumed the presidency in Kinshasa, he brought Masasu, as he was more commonly known, along with other generals to work in his new government, and the commanders in turn brought along people of their own ethnic groups and regions. The Balgamirs joined up and moved from the east to Kinshasa, but Kabila soon revealed he had little interest in maintaining this broad coalition. He appointed close friends and family to government positions, began to jail political dissidents and human rights advocates, and prevented the United Nations from investigating the slaughter of thousands of refugees in eastern Rwanda, for which his own men were responsible. He soon fell out with his former ally, Anselme Masasu Ndanga, as well, whom he suspected of plotting a coup. In 1997, Kabila had Masasu arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison. During the next 2 years, the Kabila government engaged in a relentless purge of anyone it thought might have been associated with the plots against him, especially Tutsis from eastern Congo and anyone who had ever had anything to do with Masasu. As Tutsis from Kivu, the Balgamirs International, anyone from the Kivu region or with links to the region appears to have been at risk of arrest and incommunicado detention without any judicial or supervision. Some were tortured, others, quote unquote, disappeared. Congo was descending once again into an all-out ethnic war. Paula and Joseph began to fear for their lives. Paula took their children out of Kinshasa and headed east, traveling by bus to Rwanda and eventually traversing Lake Tanganyika to Tanzania and later Zambia. Eventually, Paula concluded that conditions were safe enough to return to Kinshasa after a month on the move, but soon after she arrived with her children, violence against those from the east resumed. In January, a group of 29 men, most of them former associates of Masasu, including Joseph Balagamir, left Kinshasa in small dugout canoes and paddled across 5 kilometers of the muddy Congo River to Brazzaville, the capital city of the former French colony, the Republic of Congo, in an effort to escape the violence. The men took refuge in a small house on Franceville Street that had been rented by a fellow refugee from across the river. When the house became too crowded, 19 of the men, including Joseph, moved to another small house at 373, Rue Lueme, in the Plateau des 15 Ans section of Brazzaville. The men received letters from the United Nations, noting that they had been in touch with the organization, important protection should they encounter deportation threats from the local government. They sought out representatives of Amnesty International to inform them about the torture, disappearances, and killings of people from Kivu that were being carried out by the Kabila government across the river. Eventually, Paula Balagamir and her children joined her husband in Brazzaville. The house on the Rue Lueme was overcrowded with the men who had fled Kinshasa, so their wives and children stayed with other refugees around Brazzaville, so as not to draw the attention of local security forces who were hostile to the refugees pouring into the city. The plan was to lie low until the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, could place the families in a safe refuge camp, or even better, in a country far from the violence. On January 16, 2001, a few weeks after the men had fled Kinshasa, a bodyguard approached Laurent Kabila at the presidential palace there and fired at least 2 shots into his back. The assassin, a man named Rashidi Minzeli, was immediately shot and killed, taking with him the only definitive knowledge about the motives behind his deed, which spawned a confounding web of conspiracy theories. Kabila's son, Joseph, assumed control of the country 10 days later, when Laurent Désiré Kabila died of his wounds. Back in Brazzaville, news of Kabila's death sent a shudder through the men who had fled Kinshasa weeks before. As they feared, the younger Kabila immediately began a crackdown against his father's political enemies, especially those associated with Anselme Masasu Nindaga. Nindaga himself was executed. Scores of others were rounded up, thrown into prison, and tortured into implicating friends, neighbors, and associates. Countless more were killed or vanished. The crackdown didn't stop at the banks of the Congo River. Kabila security forces have been cooperating with the government in Brazzaville to patrol the river banks for refugees and fleeing political rivals who could be detained as suspects in the quickly growing conspiracy. In the middle of the night of January 28th, police descended on the house on the Rue Lueme and arrested the men inside, including Paula's husband, Joseph Balagamir. Paula was 5 months pregnant and had 5 children when her husband was arrested. She and the wives of the other men who had been arrested began a panic search for their husbands. They besieged the local UNHCR office, demanding to know the whereabouts of men who had applied to the UN for safety. Pressed by the UN and Amnesty International for an explanation, the government in Brazzaville at first denied any knowledge of the men's whereabouts, then said they had been moved to the interior of the country for their own safety. Days later, through a report on an African radio news service, the wives and families of the men learned the dreadful, in obvious violation of international law, which forbids nations from sending asylum applicants back to countries where they may face harm. No one knows exactly why the men were handed over. A rumor circulated that they were given to Kabila as part of a prisoner exchange. Perhaps Kabila's government simply paid a bounty. But whatever the reason, there was little doubt about what awaited the men when they arrived into Kabila's hands. The men were jailed and re-education center in Kinshasa, known to most locals by its old name, Makala. Makala and is a place of extraordinary brutality. A 2003 U.S. State Department report on human rights in the Democratic Republic of Congo stated that at least 100 others from malnutrition or disease. Inmates at Makala were regularly deprived of the most basic necessities. For several weeks in September 2002, the State Department reported the prison provided inmates no food whatsoever and political dissidents into a high security section of Makala called Pavilion 1, held incommunicado and without formal charges. Eventually, they were lumped into a group of the supposed earlier coup attempt. In trials that were roundly denounced by human rights groups, the 19 were eventually given death sentences. They were among the fortunate. Some 30 of the supposed Kabila plotters were sentenced to death. The United Nations, embarrassed by the handover of men who had sought its protection to such obviously dire circumstances, responded by expediting resettlement proceedings for the wives and children of the men who trust the institution had violated. But resettlement in Europe or the United States presented the women with a painful decision. Separated from each other and half a world away, they could not advocate for their jailed husbands as effectively as if they stayed together nearby. Further, inmates in Makala depended on family and friends to bribe guards to get them food and other basics. But Paula had her children to care for. She could not return safely to Kinshasa, and even Brazzaville was becoming risky. Congolese security forces from Kinshasa were now combing Brazzaville for Kabila's political enemies, and violence against Tutsis was becoming widespread. Paula lived in Brazzaville for nearly 3 more years in a state of unrelenting fear. Her children couldn't attend school. She had no reliable income, but she held out hope that things would calm down and that her husband might be freed. At one point, it seemed possible. Kabila announced an amnesty for some of the men imprisoned at Makala, but in the end, Joseph was not among those released. The final straw came, Paula said, when she and another woman were nearly corralled by a mob intent on burning them alive. The 2 women escaped, and Paula resolved to get out of Brazzaville however she could. The UNHCR offered her resettlement in the United States, and in November 2004, Paula left Brazzaville with her 5 children, destined for Georgia. Paula and her family, Josue the oldest, Grace, daughter Christelle, twin boys Manas and Ephraim, and a newborn baby girl, Gloria, were placed in an apartment complex called Willow Ridge. Through the International Rescue Committee, Paula found a job as a seamstress at a factory that made sports jerseys. The work wasn't bad, but the commute was more than an hour each way, requiring Paula to leave home at 5:30 each morning. Through contacts in the refugee community, she eventually met Luma, who encouraged her sons, Grace and Josue, to come out to play soccer and eventually hired Paula to work at her cleaning company. Since arriving in the United States, Paula's only contact with her husband has come through telephone calls he was able to make on cell phones borrowed from the friends and family members of other inmates at Makala. Grace, who was just 5 when he last saw his father, said he can barely remember his face. If the family is to be united, Paula said, it would have to be in the United States. There's no point in thinking about where to go back to, she said, because there's nowhere to go back to. So because I have actually another appointment, I have to end here with only 1 chapter, but I just wanted to say, yeah, things, as we know, outside in the world has been going pretty badly with ongoing unrest. So whatever happens will continue to happen. But I guess I just want to say that, first of all, thank you so much for all of the views from the other videos I've seen so far. I started this out honestly just as a way to pass the time during the pandemic, and then I didn't realize at all that people would be able to watch and to listen and to hopefully follow along with this journey, because this book is really, really good, and I strongly recommend it if you are able to get a copy of it. Yeah, it's really, really hard out there for a lot of different people and a lot of marginalized groups. And I cannot imagine what it is like to be a refugee, to have to uproot your entire country, your entire home with all of your family members, to not know whether or not your husband is dead or alive, and to have to go through so many things just because you want and need to survive. But there is always hope. There is always hope. So I really hope that you will continue with me, and I hope to soon do another chapter one day. Thanks.